Roby and welcome to my workshop. Garden projects. A composting system.
Well, we are starting a garden, and this is the first step. I have built raised beds. They've yet to be filled with earth yet, but the beds are clearly here. And yes, I did make the forms, I poured the concrete, I put the reinforcing in. All that will be subject of another episode in the future. The forms I used to build these have warped a little bit, so there is an opportunity to build them all over again. But if you're going to garden, there's one thing you really do need to do, and this is a long-term event. You've got to compost. So, over here, let me show you what our episode is going to focus on. Well, this is my compost heap. I wouldn't even call it a pile. I just did get a catcher for my lawnmower, so I put the clippings over here, and it's fall, so I've got about a 50-50 mix of grass and leaves. That's actually a pretty good mix to start with, so I'm pleased with the mix I have, but we need to manage this, and that's what the Cedar is for. We're going to build a compost management system, and it's going to have 3 bins where we can move it from fresh clippings and fresh refuse and move it to the center bin, and then the final bin where it will be soil ready to put into the garden. I wanted to use cedar because it doesn't rot. Now, we could have used those concrete panels, but they don't work real good about too high. That's all they're good for. If I go too high, they're not stable. So I don't think that's the right application for that product. The cedar will be good, and we've got some other pieces in there that are going to make it really easy to work with. So let's head down to the shop and let's build ourselves a composting system. Well, this is my stock. I've got a number of 4x4s, 4 of those. I've got 7 2x4s and a number of pickets. All this is going to help us create a 3-bin system for managing compost. And based on the cost, we are going to treat this wood reverently. So first thing to do is let's separate the stock. We're going to start with our columns. This is the first of my 4x4s, and we have to start thinking about the end of the project right from the beginning. You see, composting requires water management. That means that this system is going to have a series 3 lids, 3 bins, 3 lids, and I want the water to drain off top. Ordinarily, a shallow slope would be about 10 degrees, but I think we're going to be right at 9.5. If I make this first one 44 inches, and then the remainder over here is 52, if you have a 4-foot span, that's 9.5 degrees. So that's going to dictate where we make our first cut. You might have been wondering, why didn't you just cut the angle in at first? You might have gotten a little more out of your stock. And I thought about that, except I really didn't know, I hadn't looked at it hard enough yet to know that all my boards were the same length. Now, these are coming out nice and flush. I have no issue here because this is the dimension I cut. This is the leftover stock on the other end, and this one right here, that's my short board. It is right at 52. So there was no extra to be had. I have to trim the rest of these back, but we're gonna hold off on that until we get at least the first piece together. I want to understand exactly what I've got before I move forward and start inducing an angle on here. Well, I told you I was winging this, and I am, but I have made a sketch. And according to that sketch, we are supposed to be 50½ inches out to out. Now, the end-to-end dimension would depend on these being 3.5 by 3.5, which are supposed to be 4x4s. Now, these are both running strong, so they're bigger than 3.5 by 3.5, and one of them is stronger than the other. So we really don't have what I would call furniture-grade uniform dimensions. But this is a compost system, so we're not going to worry about that too much. Let's call it 3.5, let's call it 3.5. And if that's the case, inside dimensions are 3 foot 7.5 inches from here to here. Now, that's important, because if I take 3 foot 7.5 inches off this board to put in here, I've got at least 52 inches, 52 and a half to put up there. I only need 51. So that tells me that I can put a top on this and a bottom on this, and I can make a single panel with one 4x4 at 8 feet and one 2x4 at 8 feet. Now, that doesn't complete our panel system here. Yes, we have some really nice hardware, some long bolts. They're going to help pull this together, and we won't spare them. But there is also a panel action that's going on in this, and that'll be a little later in the episode. So stay put. We've got some work to do on these front columns because there's another detail here that we need to address. The front bins are going to have cedar pickets in front of them. That's what's going to hold the compost in. And we put these cedar pickets in there because they're easy to take out. They'll be cut to length and they will stack up on top of each other, and they will actually fit into grooves that are going to be milled into the front posts. So if I want to turn the material or move it out, I simply take the cedar pickets out and then I have access to my material. Now I have a dado stack in my saw right now, and it's set at 5/8. These are running about a 1/2 inch strong. I've made a test cut right here with an old piece of pine, and it seems to work pretty well. And I think those will slide in and still give me some good support. So with that said, let's go ahead and make our cuts, keeping in mind that the outside posts only get one cut because there's nothing to go on the other side. And the inside posts, those get 2, nothing on the back. We have 4 panels with a front and a back column, and 2x4s connect them. Now on top, it's a slope and it's on top. On the bottom, it's in between each of the boards, and it is connected something like this. I don't want it right on the bottom, I want it close. Now, we could use pocket screws to connect with this, but I don't think that's going to be strong enough in the long run. We're going to use lag bolts. Now, if I put the lag bolt right there, you can already tell there's not enough meat there to grab hold of. We're going to have to countersink these, and I've got my drill press set up accordingly. Not only that, we're going to drill out the hole because I don't need these threads to engage this board. I need them to engage that board. Now, we will get not 1, but 2 lags for each 2x4. And where we have a groove, we have a connection. Where we have 2 grooves, we have 2 connections. And we want them centered on the outside, on the faces like this, because the mesh that we're connecting to, we're going to staple it up to the bottom of this board too. That's going to help us with our shear action across the panels. That's why we don't have to cross brace them. So we've got a lot of holes to drill, and we do this in the front and back columns. Finally, keep in mind, this is the side you drill from. I was using that for illustrations. I have actually marked all these boards where they're going to be drilled. It's very important on the front columns because these grooves are asymmetrical. On the backs, it's not so much. So let's get busy.
We're using a 3/4 inch Forstner bit to countersink, and that'll accommodate the 7/16 socket that drives the 1/4 inch lag home. The fence is set at the appropriate depth, and my 2 clips make sure that my holes are aligned correctly against the bottom of my post. We're using a 5/16 bit to finish out the hole. I do not want the threads to engage the post, just the 2x4 on the other side. Some of you are probably asking what's wrong in this picture, and yes, the bit has to be disengaged from the chuck in order to drill the next hole. This might be considered a mistake, but having evaluated the situation, I would have done it this way anyway. You see, the bit is set up to reach the bottom. If I had set it up any higher or lower, I wouldn't have gotten there. And I don't have a longer bit. If I did have a longer bit, I would have had to have lowered the table, and all my settings would be off, keeping in mind the table height was set by the Forstner bit. At the end of the day, this is the right approach.
Well, this is one of my 2x4s, and it is going to be, part of it is going to be the bottom that connects the 2 columns together, and that's 43.5 inches. So I have cleaned up this factory edge on the bottom. I've got good square straight edge, and I have installed a jig that has a stop on it that allows me to cut the same dimension, 43.5 each time. I'm laying out my panel again for 2 reasons. 1, I want confirmation that everything is fitting up. And 2, you need to see what's going on. So let me tell you what we've got. This piece, the front column, is lined up against my bench edge right there, and against its end is lined up with the edge of the bench over there as well. I have two bottom boards that are tight against it with this column pressed in, and that edge is lined up against my bench. So this is square because my bench is square. I have taken an old fence. This was for an Inca crosscut sled, and I use it to cut very long miters. And I know that this edge right here is straight. So I've lined up the corners on either end, and I've checked the angle with my speed square, and it's 9.5 degrees. And that's what I calculated. So I'm getting real comfortable with how this is laying out. Now, it wasn't 9.5 degrees at first. Recall, the front columns right here are cut to length because I have cut all of them at the same time, and they're all indexed against this edge right here. That edge is going to get cut off at an angle, so when we cut this off, we index against that side. These ran wild, so my boards weren't all the same length. That end down there has been cut, but this end hasn't been, and we didn't index against this. This is the shortest of the boards. This is the one that was closest to 8 feet, so it's natural that if I have a longer board, I'm going to get a different angle. So it's going to be very important that we index against each of these cut ends and make our miters not only to the right angle, but make the board to the right length. This is not a unique setup. I have my station right here, and I have a positive stop right over here on this side. Now, things to note, that positive stop, it does get you the length right, and my saw is set up at the right angle, but that doesn't help any. If you cut this board backwards, you're in trouble. Check your grooves, make sure you know where they are. Check your holes, you should be able to see them. Double check each time to make sure that you're cutting the right side. Well, we're back in the rack and we're checking things out. Now, we cut all these boards at 43.5. They were 8 feet, and we have roughly about 4 feet, 4 inches. And that was enough to get from here to here. And this is the cutoff. And when I marry it up and just finger tight right there, I can visually see that I've got extra over there. Now, I don't want this to come out this way. We are going to go ahead and clip this, and then we're going to clip it at the same angle we just cut these at, and that will give me a good square edge. After we do that, we'll mark these, and we'll cut those to length. These are my top boards, and I have them laid out, and then this is important. We're getting ready to set up on this cut because we want to cut that groove out. We want the boards to be able to go through the top. Now, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. This one right here. This is where I'm going to be making my cut. I've got 2 on this side, and I've got 2 on this side, and I've got 1 right here. Making these marks is important because if you've cut one by accident, you can't go back and put it back. Make sure your bevels are all lined up as well. So now we know where we are. Let's go ahead and set up. We've marked this first one. Let's set up to cut this.
We'll mark the shoulder with a speed square, and it is at 9.5 degrees. We'll put a few marks in on the face as well. These are mostly guidelines. When we get our fences set up, those will dictate where the cuts are.
I'm setting up to make these little hip cuts, and it dawned on me that I could get the most out of this saw right here if I took a few extra steps. The first 2 are relatively simple. I've got a backer board right here, and with this board in place, indexed across the fence, and this board up against it, I get the most out of my blade. And that's about where I want it to be. I don't want to be any farther than that because I start to lose support on this side of the saw, but that's pretty good. Second, I have a stop in place, so when I push forward like this, I'm in the right place. Those 2 things will have to change when we move to the other side of the saw, but it's relatively easy to accomplish. Now, there is one other thing here I want to point out. This is a feature of a lot of compound miter saws. It may be on yours, it may not. Most of them that have the move back and forth attachment have this. Take a look right here. I have a screw right here and I have a tab. Now what I've done is I have put this little piece of wood on there. And the reason for that is when I come down, that screw impacts the wood at the appropriate depth. so I don't have to worry about that. And that's going to be the same for all cuts. Now, if I were to take this piece of wood out, there's a little screw down there, you could flip that back and then adjust the screw. The device is made to make a cut about 1/4 of an inch to maybe a 1/2 inch tops. Proud of the bed. It's not really designed to come this high. So be careful with this. Your saw may or may not have an attachment like this. I'm going to take advantage of mine.
Having completed our shoulder cuts on the compound miter saw, we're going to turn to the bandsaw, and the first step is to get the fence set to the appropriate depth. After that, it's a simple cut. We cut straight to the shoulder cut. There's no need for a stop, we'll just eyeball it. Because we're at 9.5 degrees, we have to finish this cut up with a handsaw.
We need to start prepping for joint assembly, and we have 2 different types. On top right here, I've got what I call a pinned connection. In other words, we are just dropping a screw right in there, and we are not trying to resist the bending of this joint. It's going to bend however it wants to. We will stabilize the panel in another way. But that allows us to sink a screw directly down. We will pre-drill, we will countersink. And it's as simple as that. We'll use 2 deck screws to do that. Now note here that I have some checking. This isn't that bad, it doesn't go through. But if it did, if it was serious, I would take a screw and I would drop it down just like this. That doesn't get rid of the checking, but it does stabilize the wood, and it gives me much more longevity out of this particular joint. Now let's take a look at the bottom, because that is a totally different animal. Well, this bottom connection, that is what I call a moment connection. It has to resist the bending force going on in this frame. And because of that, we have 2 lag screws going right here and right here. And they will countersink deep, and they will mobilize the bending force in this joint. Ordinarily, with a finer piece of furniture, I'd use a mortise and tenon, and that would be very stout. Now, a couple of things about this. When you countersink, and we will countersink into this board right here because it gives us an enormous amount more strength. In softwood, this is softwood, you need to be slightly smaller than the shaft, not the threads, but the shaft of this screw, so that you actually do push out a little bit. Now, for hardwoods, that's not true. You want to be slightly larger because the threads will do the work for you. This gives you, I've been told, 80% more strength out of your connection, and that's what we want. Another thing, if you'll look, this is the bit that I've chosen. That's the bit that I need, and I'm not going to get very far with that. Matter of fact, I'm not even sure I can mark it. But what I can do is I can take a screwdriver, and the head of this is roughly the same size as the hole that I've drilled. You can do the same thing with a Phillips. And I push it through, I take a mallet, I pop it, turn it 90 degrees, and I pop it again, and then I've got my mark. And that will work in this softwood. One final thought. You've seen me work real hard to preserve material here, and that doesn't stop here in the shop. Once we get this outside, I would prefer I preserve that material for a number of years. My hope is that this project will last 10, maybe 20 years. That was the reason for the choice of material. The end grain is the most susceptible. That's where you're going to get the rot. Now, I have made water features and mailboxes and things of that in the past out of wood. And generally, I'll make that out of ipe or epi. It depends on what you want to call it. It is a tropical hardwood. It is so hard and so dense, it sinks in water. And they use it for boardwalks, the boardwalk decking material everywhere. Now, they sell a product called Epi Seal, or you can also find it Epi Oil. And we're going to paint the ends with that. Now, it goes on about as ugly as it can be. It's white, but it dries clear. I've got a couple of samples here. I figure if it works for ipe, it's going to work for this too. And it doesn't hurt sealing the end grain of this wood. So everywhere I've got a cut, everywhere I've got exposed end grain, I'm going to be painting this product on in order to seal this. So when you see all these white pieces show up, that's what you're looking at.
The panel is secured to the bench in a square, so we'll take this opportunity to make our holes in the bottom boards. We'll countersink first and then follow up with a hole for the screw. Now that the top has been marked and drilled out, we'll disassemble the panels so that we can drill out the holes for the bottom boards. Before we reassemble, let's paint our ends. Insert your lag screws and then get ready to drive them home. But before you do, make sure you've got a gap in there. That'll help tell you when you're starting to close up the joint. Now don't over drill these things. The first one's easy to see when it's tight. The second one's a little different. Take it slow and don't strip out that joint.
Well, with good square cuts and good lumber, it should all start to square up. With that moment connection done at the bottom, these should start lining up pretty well, but take it slow. You just want to drop this into place, and I actually like to, just like the bottom, pull this out a little bit until the pin comes through, and then we can get it put in place. Now, you see that up there? There is a little warping going on in this wood, so I'll go over there and pull it tight and then finish up over here. Well, we've been hard at it, and we have the first of our panels installed. This is 1/4 inch wire galvanized mesh, and it is great for composting because it's tight enough to hold everything in, but it allows it to breathe, so we get a good compost, good air flow circulation in here. Now you're probably asking, what is this support? Well, the mesh doesn't come any taller than this, so that's kind of where it ended for me. I had to make a connection somewhere. This is a fence picket ripped in half, and we're using 1/2 inch staples. So it actually turned out to be pretty nice. It's very sturdy, and I think it will serve us well. Come over to the bench. Let me show you what we've got going on over there, and we'll install another one of these. I pretty much know exactly where I want this thing to be on the bottom, and I have my square set up here. That's the distance from the bottom to where I want to staple it. Additionally, I have this back here that I have bent to give me a good line on this, and I'm using the square of the steel mesh to get everything located well.
With the first staple in place, we'll go ahead and finish out the edge, making sure that we stay square with the mesh. Pull the other side tight and set another staple. Now my top is a little better than 1/2 inch, and I've never had a staple come through, not even to touch, but still, keep your fingers away. The 3 sides stapled, the top goes in pretty fast. The top panel goes in the same way, just make sure that you've got some overhang on the ends. That overhang is important. It really does help you install the mesh better. Plus, you're cutting it off with an angle grinder. This is one of those cases where eye protection is critical. It's important all the time, but these metal shavings can really cause a lot of damage. Put on your specs.
Well, I had set up, as you see, to make the final take when the truck came with compost and topsoil for those raised beds. That took me outside, and then things got busy. This morning, I've been doing the final bit of prep work on those beds to receive that topsoil and compost. It's sitting in my driveway right now, so we need to get it out and over there. Part of this morning's activities is to prep the soil for this unit, and that's the reason I've come back from outside into here to finish up this episode. But let's talk about this for a moment. All my screening is in place. These panels are good and sturdy, and they have a lot of shear strength. I wanted to set this up to give you an idea of scale. Also, my boards right there, that's what the front of the unit's going to look like. They'll stack up to about here. So when you see this from the front, it's going to be a pretty good looking unit, and that's primarily the way it's set up in the backyard. When we're sitting on our porch, this is what we're going to see. It's not going to look much like a compost heap, and I think that's important. Now, we'll put these in place after we got the ground level across the whole bit, and we will put our screening in place after we have these panels braced. Now that screening will give it a lot of shear strength, and we'll probably have a few cross members in there to boot. But I did want to give you an idea of scale here. So if you've liked this, subscribe and give me a like. And I hope to see you next time in Roby's workshop.